Greetings to the viewers of Channel 24. Vladyslav Novikov is in the studio. We are about to begin our broadcast. With me today is military expert David Sharp. David, hello, Happy New Year, as we are meeting you for the first time this year. Good to see you. Hello, Vladislav. May this new year bring to all viewers an improvement, a marked improvement over the last one. We hope so. But despite all this, let's work and help our viewers today. We have a chance to discuss the current situation and the prospects for 2025. I shall begin with information from the Institute for the Study of War. The Ukrainian Armed Forces have broken through in 3 districts of the Kursk region and advanced by 8 kilometers. At the same time, Russian troops are increasing pressure on the western flank. I would like to outline the situation for viewers and reconstruct the chronology of events. What do you believe is the current situation in the area, and what are the goals? Let's talk about the goals separately. Let's start with what's going on there now. Until yesterday, Ukrainian Armed Forces in Kursk region were conducting a purely defensive operation, while Russia, using its allies, was trying to push through, looking for weaknesses, with the overall goal of cutting off the Ukrainian army's logistics in this area to force it to leave Kursk. Yesterday, January 5th, the Ukrainian army unexpectedly counterattacked. In the first stages, it was unclear what was happening, and this is a common situation for this war. When everything is covered in fog, it is difficult to understand the plans of the attackers, the order of operations, and most importantly, the scale of the forces involved. You can judge by the scale how far these plans go. For example, when the Kursk operation began in August 2023, there were initially reports, including from sources supporting Russia, that the Ukrainians were attacking in small forces, giving the impression of a small raid. Но сделать вывод можно все же, что речь не идет об операции с далеко идущими целями, которая равносильна тому самому летнему наступлению в Курской области. И не тот порядок сил задействован, однако это было... In the end, it turned out that it was about an operation with far-reaching goals. Judging by the current situation, despite the fog of war, we can conclude that we are not talking about an offensive with far-reaching goals, as in the summer in the Kursk region. The forces involved are not as large, but it was a series of large counterattacks. I do not rule out that the counterattacks did not take place in the places where the Russians are advancing. Russian offensive plans seem to be independent of the Ukrainian offensive and pressure. They attacked in a quieter location. There appears to have been a surprise effect, and while these sources cannot always be ignored, they provide useful information. The AFU actively used means of electronic warfare, which allowed them to advance successfully at a number of stages. We even saw columns of equipment that, if not for counterattacks, could have advanced even more successfully. With the passage of time, perhaps we will see what goals the Ukrainian command is setting. И сосредоточить такие крупные силы незаметно и внезапно атаковать с далеко идущими целями было бы невозможно по целому ряду причин. Однако хорошо спланированная контратака, которая застает противника врасплох, нам рано еще делать выводы, насколько она застала противника врасплох, это серьезное средство нарушить его планы и серьезный способ нанести противнику потери. Есть такие постулаты, которые не верны, что, мол, атакующие всегда теряют больше, чем обороняющиеся. Ничего подобного, если атака эффективно организована и застает оборону врасплох, либо просто реализуется так, что оборона оказывается неэффективной, неэффективные обороняющиеся несут потери, И, возможно, здесь мы увидим те цели.
It all depends on the order of forces involved.
Мы увидим окончательно, каковы цели украинского командования. Опять-таки, все упирается в порядок сил, который в итоге задействуют. И не окажется ли, что это неким
And whether it's just an auxiliary strike before the main attack. We always remember that in recent months, the AFU has not had a large number of reserves, much less reserves capable of successfully accomplishing offensive tasks against a defending enemy. Such a task was the first operation in the Kursk region. That operation in the Kursk region was a definite surprise. To put it mildly, and was a surprise to the Russian command as a whole. Perhaps something is being planned now, but I would not count on it 100%. So far, we are seeing what we are seeing. So you believe that the situation has not yet come to an end, and that we are, let's say, in some kind of local culmination? I am not sure that it has come to an end. Life has taught us that surprises are possible. Without intelligence data, we cannot make final conclusions. I recall the situation in Kursk region before the offensive. The press claimed that the Russians were preparing an attack on Sumy region, but it turned out that they did not even have forces for defense. The offensive was prepared by the Ukrainians. This is an example of not making far-reaching predictions. So far, it appears to have been counterattacks to improve the tactical position. Among the targets discussed on the internet and in the information field, one can find many different versions as to why this is happening. One of them is that the whole attack is political in nature, as Keith Kallig is expected to arrive in Ukraine soon, and Trump is expected to be inaugurated. If we consider the political version, Ukraine is preparing to strengthen its negotiating position in order to exchange this territory in the future. This is only one of many versions. If we remember the campaign on the Kursk region and how it started, the military purpose was declared from the beginning. It was declared as a preventive defense because Russia had accumulated forces and could strike. Later, as you mentioned, there was a purely defensive operation. I'd like to ask your opinion about the objectives, because if the past attack on this area was due to the Russians building up forces to attack, what are we seeing today? Is it political or military in nature? It is important to note that there is always a lingering interest about the previous target, but we can clearly rely on facts. Last time, the Russians did not build up forces in Kursk Oblast. Their defenses were weak, and the Ukrainians broke through, advancing over a considerable area. The AFU forces, according to the German General Staff, were between 4,000 and 6,000 men, plus several thousand auxiliary forces, totaling less than 10,000 men. The numbers may vary slightly, but the order of forces was such that they smashed the Russian defenses and took almost 100 kilometers of territory, with very few Russian forces there at the time, which made it easy to advance. That was a media explanation, not an explanation of any other nature. Today, there are significantly more Russian forces in Kursk region. According to various reports, their number reaches 50 to 60,000, including Russians and North Koreans. Although this is an exaggeration, and not all forces are combat forces. These forces are superior to what they were in August 2023. At that time, there was no group ready for an offensive, but today there is, and theoretically it would be possible to attack it, but this would require a serious preponderance of forces.
Если тогда бы атаковали тех, кто собирается наступать, то есть целью разбить группировку, которая готовится к наступлению, она бы там была. Там ее не было. Сегодня как раз она есть, и сегодня теоретически, подчеркиваю, можно было бы атаковать для того, чтобы разбить тех, кто уже наступает на украинцев, либо готовится к этому.
It is necessary not only to achieve tactical surprise, but also to create an advantage in strength. And this, I'm afraid, is impossible today. That is, to create an advantage in forces. So it is possible today to achieve tactical success, to defeat the enemy in an area where he is not ready for defense. Probably such goals were set. Far-reaching goals are set only for powerful units and formations, powerful and numerous, which apparently is not the case. So here, I don't think we are talking about a political goal. The political goal, let's say the military political goal, is to occupy a large territory. This can be either a military or a political goal, but to occupy a large territory, as I have already said, you need to defeat a ready grouping with large forces. If you don't have that, if you don't have your large forces and you can't defeat a large grouping, you can occupy a small territory relatively, defeat a few battalions of the enemy, occupy a few tens of square kilometers, yes, in the case of a successful offensive. This will not change the political and strategic situation much, since Ukraine controls about 500 square kilometers in the Kursk region. Capturing a few dozen more kilometers will yield only a small result. Although it will be a moral boost and a local victory, at the strategic level, in the context of negotiations, it does not matter much. And I don't think it's anything particularly important to the Trump administration. In any case, any success of the Ukrainian armed forces achieved at an acceptable price is important for Ukraine, important for the Ukrainian military, and important for morale. For this success to be of a negotiating and strategic level, it must have the appropriate scale. If it's something like that, then we can talk about it. How effective were the Russians defensively in this respect? It is difficult to draw definitive conclusions here. In the end, it all comes down to, firstly, the losses of the sides. And here we don't know anything for sure. Who fulfilled their task? We don't know yet. The Ukrainian command had a minimum and a maximum task. If they have fulfilled their minimum task, then it does not matter what the Russians think. They have achieved their goal. The Russians, apparently, did not have the task of losing any territory or positions, so their minimum task is more complicated. But in fact, everything is a military matter, the fulfillment of tasks. First of all, it would be important to know them.
Мало ли. Все-таки в информационном поле также бытует мнение, что это мог быть какой-либо отвлекающий удар.
We could talk about effectiveness. There is also an opinion in the information field that it could have been a diversionary strike. But a diversionary strike, the word diversionary has all the deep meaning. In order to distract something from someone, it is desirable to use such forces that will force the enemy to divert its forces, and considerable ones at that, from the area where you want to strike, or from some areas where offensive operations are underway. When the attack is relatively local, by battalions or a few battalions, there is no reason for the enemy to heavily withdraw significant forces from neighboring areas unless there is a significant threat. But on a localized level, within the framework of the fighting in Kursk Oblast, this strike may entail one or another change in the Russian army's actions. Then it's also pulling a diversionary strike. An offensive action that presses in several directions, trying to advance. When the Russian army has a hypothetical problem in the defense, you have to plug some gap. It can influence the decision of the high command to continue offensive operations, to stop, to reorganize, and so on. So here, perhaps the strike could be called either a diversionary strike, if they don't plan to offensive somewhere else, or a strike to improve the tactical position and perhaps influence the enemy's plans in neighboring areas. The so-called DPRK soldiers, how much are they involved? What is their effectiveness? Perhaps a parallel question. Do we see them in other territories? If not, why the questions here? Of course, if we take it seriously, the effectiveness should be discussed by the Ukrainian military, who face them directly, fight with them, and have something to compare them with. We rely on open sources, somewhere on interviews, somewhere on video.
Мы опираемся на открытые источники, где-то на интервью, где-то на видео. Тем не менее, кое-какие выводы можно сделать. Они достаточно, по крайней мере, в ряде эпизодов, они решительно идут в атаку. Это можно сделать выводы. Делают это довольно бесхитростно, но в этих случаях иди знай, кто тут больше виноват. Их командование непосредственно, либо это проблемы с координацией с российским командованием. Они не то чтобы полностью не считались потерями, но тут очевиден подход, когда, скажем так, не совсем западный, мягко говоря, во всем, что касается потерь. Они действуют достаточно крупными группами.
Nevertheless, some conclusions can be drawn. They go on the attack quite decisively, at least in a number of episodes. You can see that. They act quite artlessly, but in these cases, it is difficult to say who is to blame. Their command or coordination problems with the Russian command. It's not that they completely disregarded casualties, but there is an obvious approach here that doesn't quite meet Western standards. As for the losses, they operate in fairly large groups, not according to Russian patterns. Their tactics, at least in some cases, resemble more traditional tactics before the advent of spy drones, kamikaze drones. Tactics that are a bit out of step with modern realities lead to heavy casualties. On the other hand, judging by Z sources, some of the advances of the Russian army and its allies in Kursk region are on the conscience of the North Koreans. Somewhere they have advanced. It appears that young fighters, new recruits who have not been training, perhaps specific North Korean training, have been sent to the front. They're often called special forces, but when we're talking about tens of thousands of people, that's categorically wrong. North Koreans at the front, according to the data, are about 12,000, although there are several thousand directly involved, which are rotating. These units are not special forces, but for localized tasks, and they play a significant role in the Kursk region.
И да, они играют определенную роль в Курской области, достаточно значительную. Там не такие большие силы участвуют в атаках и непосредственных столкновениях, поэтому...
North Koreans are involved in the Kursk region and not elsewhere, perhaps because of the relationship between Kim Jong-un and Russia. This is surprising, as it should not matter to him where they are located.
В отношениях между Северной Кореей и Россией, что Ким Чен Ыну важно, чтобы, значит, это не была украинская территория. Меня бы, кстати, это немного удивило. Уж кому-кому, а ему-то должно быть все равно. По идее, но по факту мы видим, мы не слышали...
Which is sovereign territory of Russia.
Слышали их на юге, а вот исключительно Курской области, то есть суверенная территория России.
If asked, I would make the prediction that they will be deployed elsewhere too, but for now, in Kursk region. How sensitive are they to the fact that Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is important to Kim? This is me talking about Kim, and the main other thing I always think is important to emphasize. The Korean military is, of course, the most interesting, in a sad way, aspect of this war. The ballistic missiles that the Koreans have given to Russia, sold to Russia, that kill Ukrainians almost daily, including in the deep rear. This is the same thing, but it is not the main thing.
важный вклад Северной Кореи в войну это в ином. Это поставки огромного количества снарядов и ракет для систем залпового огня.
Unfortunately, North Korea's much more important contribution to the war is the supply of huge quantities of shells and rockets for multiple launch rocket systems. By no means the longest range ones, but apparently we're talking about millions. And apparently we're talking about tens of percent of the entire projectile power of the Russian army engaged at the front in the past year. That is, if it were not for North Korea, Russia would have fired less intensively, which means that the advance would have been less deep. The gains on the front, I mean territorial gains, would have been less. The Russian army still relies heavily on large-scale massive artillery fire, and here North Korea's contribution to this aspect was very large. Despite the fact that this aspect has received far less attention than North Korean soldiers on the front lines. The DPRK provides Russia with cheap labor to produce shells, paying minimally to its citizens who may die in the factories. What matters is how much influence such a military-industrial rear will have in the long run.
Залатывание дыр и, глобально они ничего не могут поменять, либо же это сотрудничество, оно может развиваться, углубляться и фундаментально влиять на войну.
This is again in the mode of patching holes, and globally they cannot change anything. Or this cooperation can develop, deepen, and fundamentally affect the war. You have touched on a very important topic. First of all, not only you, but also the transmitters, who are fighting at the same time and who replace each other. There are rumors that they are ready to send more, but let's not rush things, God forbid. By the way, on the patching holes and the long term, this is a key point. North Korea's production potential is probably known to US and South Korean intelligence, but not very well known to the general public. I have my doubts that they will be able to supply shells at the stated rate. On an intuitive level, I think Russia was quick to get shells from storage rather than from production. First of all, sometimes dates got caught, and in general, where can you get millions, for example 2 million shells at once? Nobody can produce them in such volumes. So they took from storage certainly, since they had been preparing for the war for tens of years, and production, even at a small rate, would have made it possible to accumulate such quantities. Here next, since they took a very significant of their stockpile, surely the question remains, did they have the next stockpile? Here they patched holes for Russia, but it was of great strategic importance. Over the course of a year, if Russia fired 35%, I'm just giving a figure, maybe the figure is even higher, 35% more shells thanks to North Korea. Thanks to that, in many ways, Russia made the territorial gains that we're all talking about today. So it wasn't just patching holes, it was a matter of strategic importance in the long term. Will they be able to do the same thing again next year on a supply scale? I'm not sure, I don't rule it out, but I think it will be less, because either they will have to empty their stockpiles completely, or reduce them drastically, or increase production. Increasing production today, even if you have cheap labor and shells, is not easy. It is in the West, and in Ukraine, and in Russia. Everyone understands perfectly well that there are serious difficulties that are insurmountable. There are thin bottlenecks that cannot be overcome easily. So I have a certain optimism in everything that concerns the long-term perspective, that the North Koreans will not be able to swamp Russia with millions on a scale, roughly speaking, as comparable to how many shells Russia itself produces per year. but that the North Koreans will be able to help at least in small quantities, relatively. And that should not be neglected either. Yes, even if 20,000 North Korean shells, I'm just saying again, are coming to Russia a month, and it's an extra 20,000 that will fly at the Ukrainian military, that's also very bad and quite a serious factor. Well, on top of that, and North Korea, of course, can supply weapons to Russia. Russia will have a growing shortage of military equipment, and supplies from North Korea and Iran, even in small amounts, will help. These countries provide the necessary products, and in return, they get what they lacked.
В рамках которого Россия получает то, что ей необходимо, ну а ее партнеры и союзники, естественно, тоже вытащили лотерейные билеты, тоже получают от России то, чего им не хватало раньше.
I would like to return to the issues of the front itself and ask you this question. What problem points would you outline on our side, specifically on our territory? As Pokrovsk, the Pokrovsk direction, the Kurakovskoye direction, the enemy is having some success there.
Покровское направление, Кураховское направление, там противник имеет некоторый успех, и также звучат разные мнения, что, мол, вот то, что происходит на Курской области... Вот
There are also different opinions that say what is happening in the Kursk region
Можно было бы кинуть резервы. В спорной ситуации, давайте с нее именно начнем, с Курской области.
Those reserves could be thrown somewhere, and accordingly, no matter what happens there, it would be possible to throw reserves in a controversial situation. Let's start there, with the Kursk region. I don't have an unequivocal 100% answer to the question of whether it is expedient to hold territory in Kursk Oblast or not. Let's just say that up to a certain point, the operation in the Kursk region could be called unambiguously successful and expedient. At the moment when they started to hold the territory for a long time, questions arose. Once again, this is a question that does not necessarily have an answer. The future will give the answer, because it was decided militarily and strategically that this territory was more valuable. That is, this territory, let's say roughly speaking, the risk of losing maybe even more Ukrainian territory, it was decided that the risk is more acceptable because the Russian territory, within the framework of negotiations, may have more value. Whether it will have more value, we will see. First of all, it has to be held in order for this to be discussed at all.
Лично я не уверен, что, скажем так, удержание 400 квадратных километров Курской области это лучше, чем потерять, это не совсем правильно делать такие сравнения, чем потерять 1000 квадратных километров в Донецкой области.
It must be held until the start of negotiations. It is necessary that this territory should not remain 20 kilometers, because it would not be serious, at least a few hundred kilometers. Personally, I am not sure that, let's say, holding 400 kilometers of Kursk region is better than losing 100 kilometers of Donetsk region. If suddenly negotiations start, hostilities stop, trade, let's call it territory, I am not sure that these 400 kilometers of Kursk region will be worth so much to the Kremlin that it will be ready to sacrifice huge Ukrainian territories. Here you go. Please get a huge part of Donetsk region. Just give us 400 kilometers of Kursk region. I'm not sure that this is the case. Perhaps I am wrong. This is a purely strategic aspect, and everything will show whether this territory will be held until the negotiations and how it will actually be disposed of during this trade. The Ukrainian command hoped but did not expect that Russian forces would be diverted to the Kursk region. The enemy, disregarding the risk of losing territory, decided to concentrate on Donetsk Oblast, considering Kursk Oblast less important.
Продвинуться гораздо глубже в Донецкой, ну а Курской области все равно Курску ничего не грозит, и на Москву никто не пойдет, как-нибудь обустроиться. Значит, и они действуют именно из таких соображений. Поэтому
no one will go to Moscow. They'll settle down somehow.
Задается вопрос, могли бы помочь силы и ресурсы, которые задействованы в Курской области в любом другом...
Both sides are diverting forces. If the resources of the Kursk region were used elsewhere, for example in the Pokrovsk direction, it would help. However, significant forces sent to Kursk Oblast could have been used elsewhere, perhaps in the same direction. The question of who distracted whom more remains open. I am almost certain that the Ukrainian military directly engaged on the ground have the answers to these questions. These answers may not always be voiced, they may not always sound pleasant to the general public, but based on open sources, who distracted whom more, I do not have an answer. I can only say that the resources involved in Kursk were very serious. Resources mean not only soldiers of selected brigades, but also ammunition. That, and the Chimera's installations, artillery fire. What can we say here, in the most difficult places, you named them, from Pokrovsk to Velikaya Novoselka, we cannot say that the front is stabilized. This section of the front needs reserves. This section of the front needs the right decisions. David, how is Israel doing? Hamas, it is written, has agreed to release 34 hostages in the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal. Therefore, how does the situation develop? The situation, if we talk specifically about gas and hostages, the negotiations are now at an important stage, which has been going on for several days, if not weeks. This is accompanied by fakes, throw-ins from different sides, and various kinds of comments from close sources that create the illusion of the proximity of an agreement. But suddenly, it turns out that there are obstacles. The meaning of the situation is roughly as follows. Hamas, globally speaking, is holding 100 hostages. Of those, 4 are people captured long ago. 2 dead soldiers from 2014, bodies, and 2 mentally unwell Israelis who infiltrated Gaza years ago. The other 96 are those captured on October 7, 2023. Of these 100, 37 are guaranteed dead, and this is known in Israel 100%. I emphasize 100%. The remaining 63, optimistic but realistic estimates of about 50, are alive. When they say that Hamas is ready to release 34 people, it does not mean that all of them are alive. Among them are women, 5 girls and soldiers, also women, as well as 2 children who are the only young children among the hostages. However, according to unconfirmed reports, they are hardly alive. We are talking about elderly people. These 34 people that Hamas has declared are only a fraction, and probably some of them are dead. This is a big problem, in my opinion. Israel should not pay a high price for those who died. I mean a price that leads to risks for the living. Moreover, when the dead are released, a very high strategic price is paid in exchange for the dead.
Ряду признакам неподтвержденных они вряд ли живы, скажем так, и в любом случае пожилых людях. Так вот, 34 человека, которых объявил Хамас, это часть из них, видимо, не живы, и это большая проблема. На мой взгляд, ни в коем случае государство...
The terrorists' incentive to keep the hostages alive disappears, because if the dead are paid for, why keep the living? What Hamas cares about is not a 6-week ceasefire, which may be the consequence of the first phase, but the end result. What matters to Hamas is the end result, which is an international guarantee of hostilities from Israel.
У террористов исчезает стимул сохранять жизнь заложниками. Зачем сохранять жизнь живым, если за мертвым мы получим очень много? Это вот такой важный аспект. Ну и что Хамас требует?
If Israel retreats and does not intervene, Hamas can rebuild its forces, receiving contraband from Egypt, building factories for rockets, holding parades and drills, preparing for new attacks with immunity.
Так вот, для Хамаса очень важно не прекращение огня временное, 6 недель продолжительностью, что может быть следствием первого этапа. Для Хамаса важен конечный результат. Конечный результат для Хамаса – это гарантия прекращения боевых действий со стороны Израиля, международная гарантия.
This is something that Israel has not agreed to so far. In exchange for the release of all the hostages, Hamas demands, in addition, the release of thousands of prisoners, thousands of terrorists, including those who have not just blood on their hands, but bodies up to their necks in the blood of Israelis.
то Хамас может просто потихоньку восстанавливать свои силы. Контрабанда из Египта будет поступать.
There is even one with 67 life sentences. If this happens, there will be a sense that Hamas has achieved a strategic victory despite its military defeat.
И это вот то, на что до сих пор Израиль не соглашался в обмен на освобождение всех заложников. Это требует Хамас, и кроме всего прочего, кроме вот этих вещей, что я перечислил, Хамас еще и хочет, чтобы были тысячи заключенных, тысячи террористов, включая тех, у кого не то что руки...
He will get thousands of his own people to replace a leadership that has been all but destroyed, and he will get immunity. We'll see what happens next. In any case, Israel is trying to pull out at least some of the hostages. That's why this humanitarian first phase is 34 people.
Своих людей, и что он, которые, кстати, заменят выбывших и заменят руководство, которое почти все перебито.
But if some of them are dead, that is a somewhat fictitious element. In any case, the situation is very tense. There are discussions and contradictions in Israeli society. The military and the leadership of the security agencies are pulling with all their might in favor of a deal. But I won't say at any price, but with an unacceptable price.
В израильском обществе дискуссии, противоречия, те же военные и руководство силовых структур всеми силами тянет в пользу сделки почти, не скажу любой ценой, но с неприемлемой ценой.
This is happening because of the threat to conscience. The command and the heads of the special services responsible for the events of October 7th have not fulfilled their duties. The situation is complex and painful.
Но это уже грошовая психология и объяснение. Ситуация очень сложная, крайне проблематична и разрывает сердца в буквальном смысле.
Yes, it's a very difficult situation. I wish that, of course, in such difficult situations, it is hard to wish for anything, even now, being in a war. Realizing how painful the situation is for many and how irreversible it is difficult to choose any words, but I think that in any case, you feel our support from Ukraine and from our channel, including from our viewers. More than 1,000 people are watching us right now. David, we're out of time at the moment, but thank you very much for joining us. It's been interesting to hear your